Hi, I'm going to talk for just a few minutes here about Exodus chapter 3. There are a number of really important things here, and they're not all immediately obvious when you read through the text. So I want to take a few minutes to highlight some of them. First of all, notice the number of times God refers to the ancestors as God is talking to Moses. That makes it very clear here that what is happening in the exodus from Egypt and sending Moses to confront Pharaoh is not something new. This is a part of the promise God had made from the very beginning. In connection with that, also notice how often God refers to having heard or seen or observed the cries of the people, and how now God is acting to end the suffering that they are enduring at the hands of the Egyptians. One other thing, notice how often God refers to the people of Israel as my people. That's both an affirmation of the prior promise to the ancestors, but it's also really important as we go forward. This is not a group of people who somehow or other become God's people. They already are. And so that's really important as we look forward to chapter 19, which we're going to talk about also. And it's really important there to remember that these people are already God's people. As Moses goes through this conversation with the God that he has encountered on Mount Sinai, Moses asks a really kind of weird question. He says, if I go to the people of Israel and I say, your God has sent me to you, and they say, what is his name? What shall I say? Now that's kind of an odd question, but let's think about it for a minute. First of all, why would the people ask that question? Well, one possible reason is Moses might be anticipating, who are you, this person has grown up in Pharaoh's house, who are you to be coming back and saying the God of Israel has spoken to me? Why would they believe that? And the only way they're going to believe that is if I know the name of the God of Israel. The other reason possibly is Moses might be anticipating, hey, these folks have been in Egypt for all this time, and there are all these many gods of Egypt. Maybe some of them have actually forgotten who the true God is. It's also possible. It's also possible that Moses here is testing the spirit that he's confronting in the bush to say, okay, you say you're the God of Israel. Okay, so what's your name? Let's be sure about who it is I'm speaking with here before I go on this potential suicide mission to go back to Egypt and to confront the most powerful man on the face of the earth. There's also something interesting about knowing the name. And I want to take just a second to talk about that. You remember all the way back to Genesis chapter 2 when God created the first person, and then God created the animals, and God brought the animals to the person. Genesis chapter 2 rather pointedly says that whatever the person called the animal, that is what they were. That probably reflects, at least in part, a thought about names and naming in the ancient world that's a little bit foreign to us. I mean, names are important to us. We want people to know our name. We feel good when somebody remembers our name and they get our name right. It always hurts a little bit when somebody can't remember your name, particularly if it's somebody important to you. But names in the ancient world were more than just an identifier. Names in the ancient world often were considered to represent the very essence of what the thing is. And that's one of the reasons why there's so much attention to changing names in the Hebrew Bible. When Abram and Sarai are called by God, those are their names, Abram and Sarai. Sarai comes from a word that means princess, and Abram Avram in Hebrew means exalted father. But later on, when they become inheritors of the promise, God says their names must be changed to Abraham and Sarah. And Abraham is a name that in Hebrew means father of a multitude, and it reflects the promise that God has made that Abraham will be the father of many nations. Jacob, after his encounter with the mysterious stranger at by the river Jabbok, as he's going back to confront Esau, after that confrontation, he is renamed. He is given the name Israel. That comes from two words that mean, as the text tells us, to contend with or to strive with God. And so Jacob's name is changed. It represents a change in the essence of who he is. Just as Abram's name changed from Abram to Abraham represents a change in his status. He is now the inheritor of the promise, and he is now to become the father of many. It's also possible here that part of what Moses is trying to do here is to gain control of the situation. He wants to gain some control over the situation by knowing the name of God and thereby knowing the essence of who God is. It's not just a God, but a very particular God, and Moses wants to know the essence of who that God is. And so he asks for God's name. What God says in response is also kind of strange. You'll notice that the NRSV and the NIV and most modern translations go with what I sometimes like to call the Popeye translation. That is, I am who I am, or I am what I am. That's not really a very good translation. I'll get back in just a minute to why the modern translations use that. But that's not really a very good translation. The phrase in Hebrew, if you saw it in any other context other than in reference to the name of God, would ordinarily be translated with a future tense. In other words, it is, I will be who I will be, or I will be what I will be. Now, the translators, the translators of the Bible, being people of faith, are a little hesitant to translate it that way because it sort of sounds like who God is open-ended and subject to change. That if God decides to be one thing today, God can be that, and if God decides to be something different tomorrow, God can be that. And I don't think that's really what that phrase, even if it's translated with future tense, is trying to convey. I think perhaps the answer to what God is trying to convey is in the follow-up when God says to Moses, this will be the sign for you that when you have come out of Egypt, you will worship me on this mountain. And it's possible that part of what God is trying to convey with this phrase is you cannot possibly understand who I am until you have seen what I do. And what I'm about to do is to set my people free. So I think maybe that's what God is trying to convey in this. It also, I have to say, keeps Moses a little bit at arm's length because it is not exactly a name, it is a description of who God is and not really a name. So Moses doesn't actually get the name of God. But what we do see in this verse, in this I am who I am, or better, I will be whom I will be, part of what is contained in that is what we often refer to as the sacred name of God, which you often see written out as Yahweh. That name, Yahweh, is a name we have no idea exactly how to pronounce it. That's a guess at best. The reason for that is that because God's name in ancient Israel was considered so holy that no one dared pronounce it, that it was something you never said out loud. In fact, the ancient tradition is that the only time God's name was ever actually spoken out loud was by the high priest on the Day of Atonement, as the high priest made the sacrifice in the innermost parts of the temple. As the priest made that sacrifice, the priest would call on that sacred name of God. There was a tradition, however, that you should never write out the name of God in its entirety lest somebody accidentally say that name out loud and thus bring guilt on themselves by potentially using that name in vain. You know, the ancient texts of the Hebrew Bible, our Old Testament, were written without any vowels at all. The text was written using only the consonants. And so later on, as people no longer used Hebrew in their daily lives and began to forget exactly how to pronounce some of the words, the scribes came along to that text written with only consonants, and they added the vowels in, but because the text was so sacred, they didn't put them in line with the consonants. They would put the vowel marks indicating how to pronounce the words either above the line or below the line, except for that name for God. The 4 letters YHWH, or in Hebrew Yod He Vav He, were always written with the consonants, but with the vowels for a different word. That was because every time you saw those 4 consonants, the word that you were supposed to say is actually an Aramaic word. It's not Hebrew, but it's an Aramaic word, Adonai, which means my Lord. And so that's actually how you get this tradition that starts in English translations with King James Bible, and it is continued down to modern translations, including the NRSV and the NIV. Anytime you see the word for God, Lord, typed in all capital letters, what that represents is those 4 consonants in Hebrew, YHWH. But again, those consonants did not carry the actual vowels for that name because that name was too holy to pronounce. The vowels they carried were for the other word, Adonai. So there's a lot going on here in this text. A request for a name, the refusal to give a name, the promise to Moses' reluctance to go, the absolute assurance that what is about to happen is all a part of the promise that had been made so long ago to the ancestors that the people appear to think God had completely forgotten about. God is assuring Moses and telling Moses to assure the people that God has forgotten nothing, and that promise that was made to the ancestors is a promise that is sure and certain and is going to be consummated in this release from bondage in Egypt. Okay, that's a quick look at Genesis chapter 3, and we'll move on from there.